Well, I'm looking forward to our discussion also as we talk about designing workplaces for neurodiverse workers. And if we could go on to the next slide. I wanted to give you some idea about what we plan to cover today, give you the plan for the day. Here we go. First, we're going to talk about spaces that work, spaces that are effective. Very briefly, then we're going to talk about our core topic of the day, which is designing workplaces for people who are neuroatypical. And then we'll bring everything towards the end, talking about how all this material can be actually used in practice. So let's move on to the next slide. So first, today we're going to talk about functions of well-designed spaces. And a space that is effectively developed will communicate, comfort, challenge, continue, and coordinate with the task at hand. So let's just spend a few minutes reviewing, what each of those little phrases means, so we can go on to the next slide. A well-functioning space communicates by actually supporting people talking to each other. There's a number of ways design can do this, from the way furniture is laid out to colors on surfaces, etc. There's a great deal of research in this regard that probably a lot of the people listening are already familiar with. Another way that a well-functioning space communicates is actually non-verbally, without words, by sending signals to people who experience the area that are unspoken. And when the messages that people are pulling out of the space where they are inconsistent with how they think about themselves, they get stressed. And I care about stress. Well, I'd like to be a nice person, but I also care about stress because when people are stressed, some of their mental processing power is diverted from the task at hand. If we go on to the next slide, we find that a well-designed, well-functioning space also comforts people. That means it really supports them feeling good, both mentally and physically. If, for example, it gives them a comfortable level of control over their experience, over their environment. That's, say, 4 to 6 choices, in terms of light levels, etc. People are much more comfortable when they have some control. A special rewards section of our brain lights up when we do. And, we see this in things like activity-based working and allowing people where to work. It gives them a psychological boost. Other ways that it spaces comfort are by providing people with opportunities to refresh mentally when they've tired out their brain doing knowledge work, by a biophilic design, things like including places with prospect and refuge in an environment that's a seat where people feel secure and have a view out over their area, the area nearby. That's comforting, for example. So there's all different ways that a space can comfort people, in a well-functioning area does. And if we go on to the next slide, we see that the third thing that a well-functioning space does is it challenges people. It really supports their development in ways that they personally find meaningful. In a workplace context, this might be something such as allowing them to learn about new topics, in training sessions, great classroom or other sorts of settings. And if we move on, we can talk about the fourth function of an effectively designed space, and that is it continues over time. Sudden change for humans is jarring, it's distracting, it's stress-inducing, etc. Humans enjoy a gradual change in the spaces that they experience. And while we're thinking about change, we can also think about something we might call psychological sustainability. When a space is effectively designed using some of the tenets we'll talk about today, it really meets people's core needs, and then they don't fiddle with it over time. They tend to leave it alone. They don't feel like they have to repaint every year, etc. All of which conserves resources in all sorts of different ways. And the fourth the fifth function of a well-functioning environment is on the next slide. And it really, we could think about this as coordinating with the task at hand. People in my world have learned a lot about how to design a space so it supports whatever activities are underway, from what sort of energy level people should be pulling from the space, to gosh, there's just so many things that we could talk about here. But we can talk. We've learned a lot about how to really effectively support collaboration, even taking a break. For example, when people are seen against a warm colored background, warm surface, they seem really just like a warmer person, which is great in a break setting. So, all different levels, environmental psychologists have thought about how workplace design can support the various activities that might take place in a workplace. And I think now that you have a little better idea about the functions of a well-designed space, you're a little better equipped to get into the meat of our talk today, which, if we go on to the next slide, is designing for people with various neuroatypical situations. And the very first one we're going to talk about is designing for people who are highly sensitive to their environment. But before we get into that, we really should make a couple points. First of all, what we're talking about today is designing workplaces, and we're talking in the context of professional situations. So people who are very extreme on in terms of the autism spectrum, or have extreme cases of ADHD, et cetera, aren't likely to actually be in the workplace. And the other thing we need to keep in mind as we move forward is that the people with these neuroatypicalities that we'll be talking about, who are in the workplace, have on their own already developed ways to function effectively in the professional world. They learned these things like while they were going to school, for example. So we have to acknowledge their knowledge. So when we're talking about people who are highly sensitive to their environment, we're talking about people who basically feel both good things and bad things more intensely. And this group also includes people with dyspraxia, which impairs motor muscular coordination as well as sensory processing. And if we go on to the next slide, we can start to talk about designing for people who are highly sensitive in a little more detail. First of all, it's important to make the point that there are some pluses of being highly sensitive to your environment. For example, you're very attentive to the world around yourself, and that can make you cautious about entering new situations, which, if they might be dangerous, can be a good thing. But to get into more of the meat of it, people who are highly sensitive will be particularly sensitive to both bad things in a space, we might say, and the good things. So if something's distracting, they will find it very distracting. And if something is great, like plants, plants do also in workplaces do all sorts of good things for us. These highly sensitive individuals will also respond more positively to those good aspects of the environment than others as well. So you would want to make sure that a space to a great extent allows people to maintain an even keel. And to support this group, you really need to provide them with opportunities to control their experience. They need to be able to remove themselves from challenging situations when they feel it is appropriate to do so. And this means providing them with access to spaces that have acoustic and visual shielding. And these shelter pods, if you will, or refreshment pods, or restabilizing pods, whatever, they not only provide acoustic, visual, and olfactory isolation, But when people who are highly sensitive and in the workplace don't need to use them, they can be used by other individuals. And if we go on to the next slide, we can start to speak about another sort of neuroatypicality, and that is well, our next topic is really designing for people who are on the autism spectrum. And it might be as much as a little over 2% of US adults are on the spectrum, one place or another along the spectrum. And autism affects how people communicate with each other and interact with the world. And it often involves some pretty serious sensory challenges. And if we go on to the next slide, we can start to talk about this in the workplace design context in a little more detail. And first, I want to make the point that there can be advantages of being on the spectrum in a workplace situation, because people on the spectrum often have enhanced pattern recognition capabilities, and they are great at working with complex systems. So again, when people are on the spectrum, their interactions with the physical and social worlds are affected. And each person with autism really, it seems like they have a different collection of things to which they are more sensitive than people usually are, or less sensitive than people usually are. So someone on the spectrum could be very sensitive to visual stimuli and not as sensitive as the rest of us to acoustic stimuli, for example. So there's different mixes for each person on the spectrum. That's why in this world, in the autism world, there's a saying, when you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, because different people have different mixes. And when people on the spectrum are thrown out of equilibrium by some event in their world, it can be great for them to have the opportunity to go into a space that's visually and acoustically shielded from the others in their workplace, and take whatever actions they have learned are useful for them in terms of reestablishing their equilibrium. For some, that this might be listening to some music really loudly, for example, or it could be smelling a particular scent very intensely, etc. Again, it will vary from person to person. And when we're thinking about these pods, it's important to think about a number, for example. And in schools that specialize in teaching people with autism, there's often one of these areas for every classroom of students. And if you sort of extend that to the workplace, you could see that one could be useful for, say, about every dozen people in the workplace that has or that is on the autism spectrum. And we can go on to the next slide and talk about some support for people on the autism spectrum beyond these re-equilibrizing or whatever, places where people can restore their equilibrium. How's that? We'll say that. So, you know, let's start to talk about some of these the issues that are relevant. Ensuring the flow of natural light into a space is important, but people with autism can have issues with shadows being present, and they're particularly stressed by glare. So it's important to the extent you can to make sure that glare is less likely, and you can do that by having light, artificial light that may be a little dimmer than usual, Make sure you have easy to operate blinds, clear story, those high windows, clear story windows, awnings, and matte finishes can all help with the glare situation. And another thing that will do that is using diffused indirect light when possible, and shielding light sources from views. Visual complexity, visual clutter is a really big issue with this population, and it needs to be managed and kept to sort of lower levels. And there's a big gnarly equation about that helps you calculate visual complexity, and nobody uses it after they turn their dissertation into their dissertation advisor. So we'll talk in practical terms about establishing visual complexity here for a moment. Visual complexity has to do with how many colors, shapes, patterns there are in a space, and whether all those, etc., and whether all those elements seem to be well organized or not. And handy for all of us, residential environments designed by Frank Lloyd Wright have moderate visual complexity. So when you're developing a place for somebody who's on, or some group that's on the autism spectrum, you want to have less visual information being conveyed than in a residential interior designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which you can use as a reference. So you can sort of think of an environment by Wright, look at a picture of one, and include a few fewer colors, patterns, etc., in the area that you're developing to keep visual complexity in check. With this group, you also need to be very careful to minimize audio and visual distractions from the task at hand. Therefore, in-wall insulation, acoustic insulation that prevents sound from traveling from one area right through to another can be particularly important, a very good idea. You also have to pay attention to sounds made by various machines in operation. You want the very quietest options possible. And you would also be interested in doing things like using durable, comfortable, sound-absorbing finishes and materials that will help with acoustics, and it can also help with physical safety. It's important to make sure that there aren't places where people might burn themselves, or sharp corners on which people might bump, etc. Also, with this population, it's great to remove opportunities for compulsive behaviors to the extent possible. An example of a compulsive behavior is counting, for example. So, if you have a wallpaper pattern that repeats over and over again, someone with autism might be might get caught up in counting how many giraffes or whatever there are in a particular wall over and over and over again. So you want to eliminate to the extent that's possible those opportunities for compulsive behaviors. Also with this group, floor plans need to be straightforward, as people with autism can have trouble developing an understanding of the form of a space, basically learning what's where and whether you turn left or right to find the restroom or the break area. And one-way circulation can really help here. So can creating zones for different activities that can lead to really positive outcomes. So this is the space where we focus on this activity. This is a space where we focus on this other activity. And therefore, open plan environments can be particularly challenging for people on the autism spectrum. It can also help to have transition areas between various zones that makes people on the spectrum feel more comfortable as they move from one area to the other. And if none of that is possible, just make sure that doorways that people will need to pass through have windows in them so they can see from one area to the next. But that window is actually an aspect of effective design in general. So probably be there whether you're thinking about people on the spectrum or not. And that's true of a lot of these things that we'll be talking about today. And also, as a final point, I wanted to make the point, make it clear that people on the autism spectrum tend to prefer familiar experiences to novel ones. So, bear that in mind while you're thinking about the form that like a break room might take, or a focus work area might take, etc. And there's actually some really interesting new research that's come out about how important biophilic design, that's designing using natural materials, natural light, as we've already talked about, natural sounds, particular sorts of shapes, etc., that are reminiscent of nature. All of that, those aspects of biophilic design can be really important and really comforting to people on the spectrum. So, keep that in mind as well. Now, moving along to our next atypicality, we're going to talk about designing for people with ADHD. It seems that ADHD, to one extent or another, may affect about 4% of American adults. And ADHD really has three main features, which are pretty much reflected in its name. But these three main features are inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So people with ADHD in particular can have issues with things such as organizing their world. And if we move on to the next slide, we can start to think about designing specifically for people with ADHD. And one of the very key, the most important things to think about when you're designing for people with ADHD is how important it is to eliminate distractions from their workplaces. And quiet and organized are probably adjectives that spring to your mind when you think about a space that's free from distractions. And that's true. People with ADHD can really benefit from cabinets and things like that that help them keep their possessions well ordered. It's important that they not be able to, you don't want glass fronts on those cabinets because that can drive the visual complexity really high. But ways to organize and manage our, papers, other resources, etc., are important for this group. And when we're talking about distractions, we have and people with ADHD, we have to be really clear to talk about the full range of things in a workplace that can be distracting. We tend to think about a conversation at a distance, or a conversation up close, or seeing somebody walk by, whatever. But for people with ADHD, the distraction list can be a little longer. For example, temperature can be a really significant distractor. And when something like temperature distracts someone with ADHD, it will really become the focus of their attention, which distracts them from the task at hand and brings them to trying to deal with the problem. That can take up, trying to get the temperature right in a space can take up could take up so much time. But you set the thermometer, return to your seat, temperature still isn't right. After a little while, you go back, etc. The iterative process can be quite time consuming. But, it goes way beyond that. Even to things like a squeaky chair could be totally preoccupying. And if you have a squeaky chair near where a person with ADHD sits, you may find them at work one Saturday morning trying to deal with that squeaky chair all on their own. So again, think about distractions comprehensively. Again, with this group, visual complexity, which we were just talking about, needs to be carefully managed and kept into sort of, little lower levels than what you would see in an interior designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. work surface lighting, actually lighting the task that people must be focused on, can really help people with ADHD accomplish what they need to accomplish in the course of the day. And even beyond that, research has shown that cooler colored light, and in contrast to warmer colored light, but cooler colored light, and you can tell the temperature of light from the bulb. Cooler colored light helps the cognitive performance of people with ADHD, and so does hearing white noise. It seems to be linked to enhanced performance of people with ADHD. People with ADHD benefit from having an opportunity to move, like a chair that might move a little bit as they sit in it can be great. Internal staircases that they can climb to move, to another meeting can be helpful as well, things like that. And people with ADHD do significantly better when they have access to nature. So if you possibly can get plants in view where people will be sitting, either inside or outside, for example, that can really help. But again, those plants are an aspect of effective workplace design generally. So let's go on to the next slide. So we also need to think about designing for people with learning challenges and dyslexia. And people with dyslexia have difficulty processing and remembering information that they see and that they hear, and they can also be challenged by organizational issues. So if we go on to the next slide, here's where I really want to drive home the point about in schools, universities, etc. There are accommodations for people who are dyslexic and have learning disabilities, and that's really accepted in those sorts of spaces, which means as people with dyslexia, move into the work world, since they're accustomed to accommodation, they expect to be able to find it in their workplaces. This means like places where they might be able to have some visual and acoustic shielding privacy, because, for example, maybe when things get tough for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, maybe it really helps them to do something like follow a line of text with their finger or something. It's just something they don't want other people to see them doing while they're reestablishing their equilibrium and ability to work. And when you're thinking about developing places to accommodate people, you can think about what's done at the schools and universities in which you're apt to draw students, because that's what the sort of support your new employees will be used to having from the places where they're doing mental work. Continuing with people who have learning challenges, it's great with this group if you consider using signage that has pictograms or similar some sort of symbols. So information can be processed in a way that's basically less stressful for this group. And people with dyslexia can have trouble with wayfinding, so you don't want to skimp on that on that signage. Often people with dyslexia are not well organized, so some of those stuff management tools that we talked about in terms of ADHD, well, they can be useful here. And it's important to make the point that feeling stressed really exacerbates dyslexia. So, those of you who are familiar with design in general, and I think that's probably a good chunk of the people who are listening today, that certain colors and smells and furniture arrangements and things like that can stress people out, and it's particularly important that those elements not be present in a place that will be used by people with dyslexia. And we can go on to the next slide. And next, we're going to talk about designing for people with psychiatric disorders. And I want to, again, reiterate that today we're talking about creating workplaces. There's actually a slew of really interesting research that's been done about designing psychiatric hospitals, much of it by Mardell Shepley, who's now at Cornell. And if you were developing that kind of place, you would need to use the kind of resources that Dr. Shepley develops. Today, we're talking about supporting people with psychiatric disorders in a workplace. So if we go on to the next slide. We'll very briefly be talking about the 6 situations that are listed on this slide, because they all affect one way or another the processing of sensory information. So first, we're going to talk about depression. And when people are depressed, they're apt to be really, really cognitively impaired if they're in a space with little sunlight. So if you know that a lot of people will be depressed in an environment that you're creating, it's very important to maximize the exposure to natural light that people will have in that space. And it if that fails, if that's not possible for some reason, there's some evidence indicating that circadian lighting can be handy for people who are depressed as well. Interestingly, people who are depressed actually see the world as a little more grayed out than the rest of us. There's all sorts of sayings, different parts of the world about how that link psychological depression with the color gray. And actually, it turns out there's sort of something there. So if you're thinking about, wayfinding systems or something like that, and you're dealing with a population who's more likely to be depressed, you need to think about the fact that the users may not be seeing the differentiations between the colors that people who are not depressed would be picking out. People who are depressed also tend to get lost more easily, and their sense of smell tends to be distorted. There's actually a bunch of jokes that aren't really actually jokes or funny about people who are depressed wearing too much perfume, for example. There is, finally, in terms of depression, there is some evidence that being near green space can help with depression symptoms. And, we've talked about green space before. And again, that's an aspect of good design. When we think about designing and post-traumatic stress disorder, the single most important design consideration is not bringing up reminders of whatever led to the stress, et cetera, to start with. This is why, for example, in veterans facilities, people where Army veterans, get psychological counseling, you won't ever see a scene that is reminiscent of a jungle, because a lot of people in those areas are still recovering from being in Vietnam. So you need to remove reminders of whatever caused the stress. And people with post-traumatic stress disorder also have larger personal space requirements than others, particularly from the back. So you need, it can be handy to have furniture that people can move a little bit one way or another, so that they can feel like they're at a comfortable distance from each other, or sofas can help because people can sit at various distances from each other on a sofa so that they're comfortable. And people with PTSD also prefer to sit in the corner of a room as opposed to towards the middle. So providing some seats in those areas can be helpful. If we're thinking about long-lasting anxiety, people with anxiety often have balance problems. So, if you're got a space that will be used by people with long-term anxiety, it's not the time for the fancy flooring that might have something like cobblestones or something that people might have to focus on a little bit because there are balance concerns. And again, people with anxiety prefer larger personal space zones. People who are neurotic, they're actually very interesting, and they tend to be mentally refreshed, for example, by things that are different than the rest of us. They can be really refreshed by looking at an urban scene where the rest of us are more mentally revitalized looking at nature. And they'll pick a home based on the restorative nature of that home, for example. People with neuroticism can also be really concerned about eye contact. So it can be handy to have seating arrangements such as chairs that are like at right angles to each other so that people can very effectively gracefully avoid eye contact when they need to. And then finally, if we think about bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, it really makes a difference what kind of bipolar disorder you have, how it affects your experience with the environment. But generally, when people are bipolar and they're depressed, they're much less responsive to their environment. And when they're not depressed, when they're manic, they tend to be particularly acutely aware of the world around themselves. And even schizophrenia influences experience of space beyond hallucinations or other things that might be symptomatic of schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia, for example, have difficulty learning how to find their way from one part of an area to another, like one part of a building to another. And they also have a need for larger personal spaces than others. So moving along to the next slide. You know, all the information that I've been sharing might be starting to make you a little nervous because, we've been talking about this group with this and that group with another situation. But really, you find that when you effectively design a space with in line with environmental psych research, neuroscience research, et cetera, when you use the research that's relevant to the general population, you can support these atypical populations as well. For example, creating different sorts of areas in a workplace with various conditions, and then allowing people to choose to work in whatever area they feel is most appropriate for them on a particular day. So, creating the range of spaces is good practice. Allowing people to select where to work, again, is good practice. Now, when we go on to the next slide, there are challenges with supporting multiple user groups, but when spaces are effectively designed using generally accepted principles that apply to the population as a whole, issues are minimized, particularly when different sort of retreat pods, refreshment pods, etc., are worked into the configuration of a workplace. And these are the areas that I was mentioning before that have really good acoustic and visual shielding. And when I'm talking about acoustic shielding, this would mean sound insulation in the walls, and walls that go slab to slab in the space, with visual shielding, some transparent walls or like a transparent panel in a door, that can be fine as long as there's a shade that can be pulled down to really very effectively block out the view. And since these areas will be needed intermittently uh, by people who are neuroatypical, it's important that they're available in the sorts of numbers I was talking about, so someone who needs one of these spaces can access it. But when these areas aren't being used by someone who's atypical, they can be used by a member of the working population who just is trying to make a sensitive telephone call, who just needs a few moments alone because their mother isn't feeling well, etc. And the fact that they could also be used by someone who's just trying to grind out that last bit of that report. So the fact that these spaces can be used by anyone in the workforce, working in a particular building, that alleviates the stigma of going into these areas as well. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see that integrating potentially conflicting requirements begins to melt away. And let's go on to the next slide. Sometimes there aren't resources available to complete all the different design modifications, renovations, etc., that might be desired. But neuroscience makes it really clear how you might want to prioritize the use of any of the resources that you have available if there isn't a clear, obvious, particular problem or situation that needs to be dealt with. So, the research shows that the first thing you'd want to think about is ventilation, because ventilation has, when you get right down to it, has to do with amount of things like oxygen in people's brains. All that's, an effectively a physically effectively working brain in terms of oxygen levels, etc., is really the foundation on which all this is built. And when you're sort of opened up the ventilation system, if you will, to make sure it's set appropriately, this can be a good time to introduce scents, something that maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about in a future talk. But there's all sorts of things that can be done scenting wise with artificial scents that won't cause any allergic reactions, that can really make a tremendous amount of difference in terms of place experience. So after you think about ventilation, you'd want to think about acoustic conditions. This is important with all the atypicalities we talked about, but also for people in general. Then think about opportunities for cognitive refreshment, mental refreshment, like nature views, nature art, plants, nature sounds, etc. in a space. Think about visual complexity. Then think about surface colors and patterns. Think about tuning lighting. Think about the sight lines, like how much people can see as they're sitting in their seat. Think about furniture design and arrangement. We're finally getting down to things like that support different personal spacing. Any sort of biophilic design elements that haven't been talked about or implemented previously would come up next. And finally, you can think about tactile experiences, because really generally people have to be right up against something to understand, to feel its texture. So tactile investments can have more limited payoff than something like a wall that's painted a particular color that many people can see from a great distance. But, being relatively lower on the list, like tactile experiences, doesn't mean those sorts of sensory experiences aren't important. It just means if you don't have resources to do everything, think about like the ventilation, acoustics, etc. First. And always remember that these, ventilation, acoustics, etc., need to be considered in the context of a particular workplace to support particular tasks that need to be accomplished. And now we can go on. We find when we integrate all of the material about designing for people who are on the autism spectrum, or people who have ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia, etc., as we've mentioned, I've mentioned that good design, good workplace design principles in general support the very best possible professional experiences for people in all of these groups. And so when we're thinking about that sort of concept, it's handy to review what good design really is in a workplace. It's things like, very first and most important is aligning with the activities planned. People need to concentrate. They should be able to concentrate in a space. Collaboration spaces are different from that, for example. Good design provides people with choice and environmental control, as we've been talking about, in general, for the population as a whole, whether they're atypical or not. Spaces have to build in opportunities for cognitive refreshment. They need to be designed biophilically. I really wish we had time today to go into all the tenets of biophilic design, but I think probably a lot of you are familiar with them. A space also needs to send all the right sorts of messages non-verbally, so people don't get stressed out. If somebody thinks they and their group are relatively important for the success of an organization, and important groups are located near the CEO, but their group is located very far from the CEO, that'll stress them out, because you need to send messages that are consistent with people's self-identity here. A good workplace reflects people's national and organizational cultures. It's an environmentally responsible space. Environmental responsibility conveys to users that they're important, and they actually work much more effectively in an environmentally responsible environment than they do in one that's not. A space needs to seem familiar to people, no jarring sudden changes. You have to be really careful with standardization and automation. Some things at the very basic level can be standardized from place to place, but not so many as you might think. And finally, you need to remember that good office design remembers that or understands that it's the perception of the space by the users that can be most important. Perceptions can really prevail over reality in many situations. So this review has talked about conditions that can support particular user groups, but you find when you're taking the actions that support those various specific groups, well, most of those for like giving people an idea of what's to come into space, et cetera, are consistent with good workplace design in general and benefit people who will be using a space outside the particular groups that we've focused on today. And the sort of mental reorientation pods we've been talking about, the spaces where people can go and work themselves back into a mental state that supports working. Well, those areas are actually useful not only to people who are atypical, but the population, the user population in general. when they're made available to all. So we do have a few minutes here. What sort of questions should we answer first?